The cruiser's shadow fell across Mark Chin's farm at 11:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, turning midday into twilight. He was checking the irrigation system when the darkness swept over the cornfield, and his first thought was storm cloud. His second thought died when he looked up. The ship hung there, silent and vast, its hull a mosaic of metals that seemed to shift between bronze and midnight blue. No sound. No wind. Just presence, like a mountain that had learned to float. Mark stood frozen, wrench still in hand, watching smaller craft detach from the main vessel like seeds falling from a dying flower. One of them was falling wrong. The pod, he had no other word for it, came down spinning, trailing smoke the color of old copper. It clipped the barn's roof, tore through his truck's bed, and buried itself in the wheat field with a sound like the earth sighing. Mark was running before the debris stopped falling. The pod had cracked open on impact. Steam or smoke poured from the breach, carrying a smell like ozone mixed with something floral he couldn't place. Through the haze, he saw movement. Small, frantic. She couldn't have been more than a child by any measure that mattered. 4 feet tall, skin that rippled between pearl and pale violet, eyes too large and dark to be human but filled with the same terror he'd seen in injured animals. Her breathing came in sharp, whistling gasps. Blood, if that's what the silver-blue liquid was, ran from a gash across her shoulder and pooled beneath her. Mark's hands moved before his mind caught up. He pulled off his shirt, pressed it against the wound. The girl made a sound, high and keening, and tried to pull away. Her hand caught his wrist. 3 fingers, he noticed distantly. Delicate. Shaking. Hey, he said, keeping his voice low. I'm not going to hurt you. She probably couldn't understand him, but tone was universal. He'd gentled enough frightened horses to know. Her grip loosened slightly. The bleeding wasn't stopping. He'd done field medicine before, farm life demanded it, but never on someone whose anatomy he couldn't guess at. The wound edges looked clean, almost surgical. He grabbed the first aid kit from his ATV, dumped it out on the ground. Gauze. Antiseptic. Medical tape. Probably useless, but doing nothing meant watching her die. The antiseptic made her flinch, but she didn't pull away again. He worked quickly, pressing gauze layers over the wound, wrapping them tight with the tape. Her breathing was still too fast, too shallow. Shock, probably. He grabbed his jacket from the ATV seat, wrapped it around her thin shoulders. Her eyes focused on him. Really focused. There was intelligence there, sharp and evaluating despite the pain. She said something in a language that sounded like wind through crystals, then tried again. Saved. The word came out mangled by a mouth not built for English, but clear enough. You saved. Not yet, Mark said. Can you stand? She couldn't. When she tried, her legs folded like paper. Mark caught her before she hit the ground. She weighed almost nothing. He lifted her carefully, adjusting his grip when she made a small sound of pain, and started toward the house. That's when the other ships landed. They came down in formation, 6 of them, forming a perfect hexagon around his property with his farmhouse at the center. These weren't pods. These were gunships, all sharp angles and purpose. Ramps descended. Figures emerged. The soldiers, guards, whatever they were, moved like water, like precision itself had learned to walk. 7 feet tall, maybe more, with the same pearl violet skin as the girl, but crossed with armor that looked grown rather than manufactured. They carried weapons he recognized only by context, things meant to kill, held with absolute certainty. Mark stopped walking. The girl in his arms stirred, said something urgent in her crystalline language. The nearest guard's weapon came up, aimed at Mark's chest. Through the helmet's transparent faceplate, he saw eyes the color of deep space, empty of mercy or malice. Just evaluation. "I'm helping her," Mark said, keeping his voice steady. "She's hurt. I'm trying to help." The guard said nothing. The weapon didn't waver. The girl spoke again, louder, with what sounded like command in her tone. The guard's head tilted slightly. Listening. Considering. Then, the weapon lowered, but only to a ready position instead of an aimed one. Another figure emerged from the central ship, and Mark knew immediately this one was different. She moved with the same lethal grace as the guards, but carried authority in her spine, in the way space seemed to open around her. Her armor bore markings that might have been rank or language or both. She approached without hurry, stopped 10 feet away, and looked at Mark with eyes that saw everything. Then she looked at the girl in his arms, and her expression changed. Something cracked in that perfect military bearing. Not much. Just enough to matter. She spoke, and the language was still alien, still crystalline, but the tone was universal. Mother to daughter. Fear transmuted into relief, so powerful it was nearly anger. The girl responded, her voice weak but urgent. She gestured at Mark, at the blood-soaked gauze, and his jacket wrapped around her shoulders. Explaining. Defending. The commander's eyes came back to Mark, measuring him differently now. She said something short and sharp. The guards lowered their weapons entirely. She stepped closer, extended one 3-fingered hand, and placed it against her chest in a gesture that looked formal. Important. Then she spoke, and this time the words came in accented but clear English. "You gave aid. When you had reason for fear, you gave aid." She glanced at her daughter, at the makeshift bandaging, at the care evident in how Mark held her. "This will not be forgotten." It didn't sound like a thank you. It sounded like a promise. The girl was lifted gently from his arms by the commander herself. Medical personnel swarmed forward with equipment that hummed and glowed. Mark stepped back, suddenly aware of the blood on his hands, the adrenaline starting to fade into trembling. The commander watched her daughter being tended, then turned back to Mark. "We did not expect to find mercy in this place." She paused, choosing words carefully. "The fleet arrives in 2 cycles. Your world's leaders will have questions. They will look for whom to credit or condemn." Her eyes held his. "They will find you." "I just did what anyone would do," Mark said. "No." The word was absolute. "Not anyone. Not in our experience." She made another formal gesture, fist to chest. "I am Commander Vissa of the 7th Fleet, voice of the Ascendant Queen. You have rendered aid to the Crown Heir. The debt is acknowledged. What comes next?" She looked up at the massive cruiser still hanging overhead. "What comes next will change everything." The ships began lifting off, one by one, taking the wounded Crown Heir to medical facilities Mark couldn't imagine. Commander Vissa was the last to board. She paused at the ramp, looked back. 2 cycles, she said again. "Prepare yourself, Mark-Chen. The Queen is coming." Then she was gone, and the ships were gone, and Mark stood alone in his ruined wheat field, staring at the empty sky where first contact had just decided his life belonged to history now. His phone started ringing. Then the second phone. Then he heard the helicopters coming from the south, and knew the commander had been right. Everything had changed. Mark's phone died from the call volume before the first military helicopter touched down. They came in hard, 3 Black Hawks in formation, kicking up dust from his fields and sending the chickens into hysterical flight. By the time the sun had moved an hour westward, his farm had become the center of a crisis that nobody knew how to manage. The officers were polite at first. Air Force Colonel Patricia Reeves introduced herself with a firm handshake and steady eyes that had seen combat and knew how to evaluate threats. Mark respected that. What he didn't respect was the immediate assumption of jurisdiction over his property, his life, his decisions. "We need you to come with us, Mr. Chen," Reeves said. Her team had already secured the perimeter, set up a mobile command post in his driveway, and started documenting the crash site with equipment that looked expensive and urgent. "Debriefing, medical evaluation, and protective custody until we understand the scope of what just happened." "Protective custody," Mark repeated. "From what?" "From whoever wants to know what you know. From the media circus that's about to descend. From the geopolitical nightmare of being the first human to physically contact an alien species." She gestured at the sky. "That ship is still up there, Mr. Chen. Silent. Waiting. And, according to their commander, more are coming." "You're now the most important person on this planet, whether you want to be or not." Mark looked at his farm, at the wheat fields he'd planted with his own hands, at the barn his grandfather had built in 1962. "I need to feed the animals, water the crops, lock the house." Reeves exchanged a glance with her second-in-command, a sharp-faced captain named Morrison. "We'll take care of that." "No," Mark said quietly. "I will. Then I'll answer your questions. But I do this first." They weren't used to civilians drawing lines. He could see it in their posture, in the way Morrison's hand drifted toward his sidearm before Reeves stopped him with a look. But there was something in Mark's voice, or maybe just the absolute strangeness of the situation, that made the colonel pause. 20 minutes, she said finally. "Morrison goes with you." Mark fed the horses first. Cisco and Maya knew something was wrong from the helicopters, from the strangers trampling the property, from Mark's own tension bleeding into every movement. He measured out their grain with steady hands, checked their water, spoke to them in low tones that settled their ears forward. Morrison watched from the doorway, weapon ready, scanning for threats that didn't exist. "You always this calm?" Morrison asked. "No," Mark said honestly. "I'm terrified. But the horses still need food." Inside the house, he grabbed his go-bag, old habit from his years as a wildland firefighter, and added his grandfather's journal, his mother's wedding ring, documents he couldn't replace. He looked around the small kitchen where he'd eaten breakfast 7 hours ago, back when alien contact was science fiction, and his biggest problem was corn blight. That life felt 1,000 years gone. His laptop chimed. Email notifications were pouring in from addresses he didn't recognize, subject lines in a dozen languages. News outlets, government agencies, universities. Someone claiming to be the Vatican. He shut the laptop, unplugged it, left it on the table. "Time's up," Morrison said from the doorway. The debriefing happened in a secure facility 3 hours north, in a room with no windows and recording equipment built into the walls. They were gentle but thorough. Reeves asked the questions while specialists in fields Mark couldn't identify took notes and whispered to each other. A medic drew blood, scanned his vitals, tested him for radiation and contaminants they probably didn't have names for yet. Mark told them everything. The falling pod, the girl's injuries, the improvised first aid, the arrival of the fleet, Commander Vissa's words. He left nothing out because he had nothing to hide, and because lying to the U.S. military during first contact seemed like a spectacularly bad idea. "You said she spoke English," Reeves said. "The commander. How is that possible if this is first contact?" "I don't know. Maybe they've been watching, listening, learning." Mark rubbed his face, exhaustion settling in. "She spoke it like someone who'd studied it but never used it in conversation. Formal, careful. And the girl? The crown heir? She said one word. Saved. That's all I understood. A woman in civilian clothes leaned forward. Dr. Sarah Chin, no relation, she clarified, ex-linguistics specialist from MIT. Did she say it like she was learning the word, or like she already knew it and was confirming the action? Mark thought back to those huge dark eyes focusing on him, evaluating him. Confirming. She knew what I'd done. She wanted me to know that she knew, which means she understands gratitude. Dr. Chen said. Debt. Obligation. That's significant. Everything about this is significant. Snapped a man Mark had been introduced to as Director Vance, NSA. We have an alien warship parked in our orbit. More coming, according to their military commander. And the only human they've communicated with is a farmer from Nebraska who used a first aid kit and good intentions. He looked at Mark like the situation was somehow his fault. We need leverage. Information. Some kind of advantage before this fleet arrives. We have advantage, Reeves said quietly. Mr. Chen saved their princess. That buys us goodwill if we don't squander it, or paints a target. Vance countered. Every foreign government is going to want access to him. China, Russia, the EU, they're already making inquiries through back channels. This isn't just first contact. This is a geopolitical powder keg with Mr. Chen as the fuse. Mark listened to them argue about his life like he wasn't in the room. He understood their positions, even sympathized. But there was something they weren't grasping, something that had been clear in Commander Vissa's eyes. She said the Queen was coming, Mark interrupted. Not to Earth. Not to America. To me. Specifically. The room went quiet. The debt is acknowledged, Mark continued, remembering the commander's exact words. That's what she said. This isn't about nations or politics or leverage. I saved her daughter. In their culture, apparently, that means something specific. What? Dr. Chen asked. I don't know. But it's personal. Individual. They came to my farm. They're coming back to my farm. Whatever this is, it's about honor or obligation or something we probably don't have a good translation for yet. He looked at each of them in turn. You can prepare all you want, but I don't think you're the ones they're here to see. 2 cycles, it turned out, meant roughly 48 hours in human time. The government spent those hours transforming Mark's farm into a fortified diplomatic zone. The media spent them in a feeding frenzy that made his phone's earlier meltdown look quaint. The world spent them arguing, panicking, and making contingency plans for scenarios ranging from peaceful exchange to planetary invasion. Mark spent them standing in his wheat field, watching the sky, and wondering what his grandfather would have made of all this. The fleet arrived at dawn on the 3rd day. They came in silence again, but this time there was no mistaking their nature. Warships, dozens of them, ranging from sleek destroyers to massive dreadnoughts that blotted out stars. They formed up in high orbit, a formation that military analysts would later describe as defensive but overwhelming, a show of force wrapped in restraint. One ship descended. Not a gunship this time. Something ceremonial, decorated with markings that even the xenolinguistics team could identify as royal insignia. It landed in the same wheat field where the pod had crashed, setting down with such precision that it barely disturbed the damaged stalks. The honor guard emerged first. 12 soldiers in armor that made the previous guards look under-equipped, moving in perfect synchronization. They formed 2 lines, weapons held in what Mark's military escort identified as a formal salute position. Not threatening. Presenting arms. Then came the Queen. She was tall like her soldiers, but where they were built for war, she was built for majesty. Her skin held the pearl-violet shimmer Mark had seen in the girl, but with an iridescence that seemed to catch light that wasn't there. Her armor, if it was armor, looked grown from precious metals and crystallized starlight, more art than protection. She wore no crown, but authority radiated from her like heat from a forge. Behind her, stepping carefully but without hesitation, came the crown heir. The girl looked transformed. The injuries were healed, the pallor gone. She wore scaled-down formal armor and carried herself with dignity that seemed practiced, but not quite natural yet. Still a child, Mark thought, trying to be what her station demanded. When she saw him, something in her careful expression shifted. Relief, recognition, something that might have been a smile if her face was built for them. The queen stopped 10 feet away. Her eyes, darker and deeper than her daughter's, studied Mark with an intensity that felt like being weighed by gravity itself. The world held its breath. Cameras from 100 nations recorded every microsecond. Armed forces on 5 continents waited for this moment to define the future. The queen spoke. Her voice carried without shouting, rich and layered with harmonics human vocal cords couldn't reproduce. The translation came through speakers that the UN had hastily installed, a rough approximation by AI working with limited linguistic data. Mark Chen of Earth, you rendered aid to my blood, my air, my heart. She placed her hand against her chest in the same formal gesture Commander Visa had used. In doing so, you have enacted the old law, the sacred debt. You have become Athavel. The translator paused, searching for words. Blood saver. Life shield. One who steps between death and beloved. Mark felt the weight of every eye on earth pressing down on him. He kept his focus on the queen. I just did what was right. The queen's head tilted slightly. Just. This word troubles our translation. You diminish the act with it. She looked at her daughter. She would have died. I would have arrived to find her broken. Instead, I found her healed, tended, protected by one who owed her nothing. Her eyes came back to Mark. There is no just in such action. There is only choice, and your choice has bound us. The crown heir stepped forward. She said something in the crystalline language, then switched to heavily accented English. He was gentle. When he had reason to fear, he was gentle. Yes, the queen said softly. Something in her vast composure cracked, just for a moment, and Mark saw the mother underneath the monarch. She breathed, a long, slow breath that seemed to carry weight beyond air. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, become personal. I am Matriarch Thessa of the 7th line, keeper of the luminous fleet, voice of the ascendant realm. And I am a mother whose daughter lives because of you. She extended her hand, palm up, in a gesture that needed no translation. The debt is acknowledged. The honor is given. What would you ask of us, Mark Chen? What price for our heir's life? Every government official, every military advisor, every diplomat who'd briefed Mark in the past 48 hours had prepared him for negotiation. Trade agreements, technology exchange, political alliance. This was the moment to secure advantages for humanity, to leverage first contact into something that would shape centuries. Mark looked at the girl who'd bled in his arms, at her mother who'd crossed stars to say thank you, at the honor guard standing in his wheat field, presenting arms to a farmer who'd used gauze and antiseptic and common decency. I don't want a price, he said. She needed help. I gave it. That's the end of it. The translator had trouble with that. There was a pause while the AI searched for concepts, for frameworks. The queen's expression shifted through several emotions Mark couldn't identify. When she finally spoke, her voice held something that might have been wonder. You refuse the debt? The sacred obligation? She studied him with new intensity. This is not done. Athavel rights are ancient, unbreakable. You have earned them. I don't want to own them, Mark said. I want your daughter to grow up healthy, to be safe, to have the chance to become whoever she's supposed to be. He smiled slightly. If you want to thank me, tell me she's going to be okay. The Crown Heir spoke then, urgent and bright, looking between her mother and Mark. The Queen listened, and something in her expression softened further. She replied in their language, a conversation too quick for the translator to catch, then turned back to Mark. She says you are either the wisest human or the most foolish, and she cannot yet determine which. The Queen's voice held warmth now, a crack in the formal diplomatic bearing. She also says that if all your kind possess such foolishness, perhaps we have chosen the correct world for first true contact. The Queen made a gesture. One of her guards stepped forward, carrying something wrapped in cloth that shifted colors like oil on water. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a pendant carved from stone that seemed to contain its own light source. Stars, Mark realized. A miniature galaxy trapped in crystal. This is the Athamark, the Queen said. Mark of the Bloodsaber. It cannot be bought or taken, only given. It marks you as kin to the throne, protected by all vessels of the Seventh Fleet, honored in all territories of the Ascendant Realm. She paused. And it means that when my daughter takes the throne, she will remember the gentle hands that saved her life when she was small and afraid. She stepped forward, placed the pendant around Mark's neck herself. It was warm against his chest, pulsing faintly with its captured starlight. Thank you, Mark said simply. The Queen inclined her head. No. Thank you, Mark-chan, for showing us that wisdom exists in unexpected places. That mercy is not weakness. That when we extend our reach across the void, we may find not enemies or resources, but friends we did not know we needed. She looked up at the fleet still holding position in orbit. My ships will remain in your system for the duration of diplomatic establishment. But they come not as conquerors. They come as those who acknowledge a debt to one of your kind, and who wish to learn if more such kindness exists among you. The Crown Heir approached Mark then, without ceremony, with just the directness of a child. She said something in her language, then tried again in English. You will visit. When the paths are built, you will see our home. It wasn't a question. It was an invitation and a promise and a child's absolute certainty that the future would make it true. I'd like that, Mark said. The formal ceremony continued for another hour. Diplomats exchanged carefully worded statements. Technology liaisons began preliminary discussions about compatible communication protocols. The media captured every moment, already spinning the narrative into 1,000 different interpretations. But Mark would always remember the moment after the cameras stopped focusing on him, when the Crown Heir tugged her mother's hand and whispered something, and the matriarch of the Seventh Line, keeper of the luminous fleet, voice of the Ascendant Realm, simply laughed. A warm, genuine sound that carried across the wheat field and somehow made the warships overhead seem less threatening and more like what they actually were, a mother's overwhelming response to her daughter's rescue. As the royal ship lifted off and the fleet began the slow work of establishing formal orbit, Mark stood in his field and watched dawn light reflect off hulls designed for war but deployed in peace. Colonel Reeves approached, her expression caught between professional composure and something like awe. The President wants to thank you personally, she said. The UN wants you to address the General Assembly. Every nation with a space program wants your input on the diplomatic process. You're going to be very busy, Mr. Chen. Mark touched the Athamark at his chest, felt its warmth, its promise. I just wanted to help. I know, Reeves said. That's exactly why this worked. She looked up at the fleet, at the future hanging overhead. They didn't come looking for our strongest, or our smartest, or our leaders. They came looking for the person who helped when help was needed. They came looking for you. The world learned, in the months that followed, that first contact could be gentle if you built it on the right foundation. That alien species could value the same basic decencies that made civilization possible. That a farmer's first aid kit and willingness to act could matter more than weapons or treaties or carefully prepared diplomatic protocols. The Ascendant Realm opened formal relations with Earth. Technology flowed both ways, carefully metered and explained. Cultural exchange began. Trade agreements were drafted. The difficult work of two species learning to coexist across the vast differences in biology, language, and history commenced in conference rooms on both worlds. But the foundation was laid in a wheat field in Nebraska when Mark Chin saw something small and scared and bleeding and decided that helping was more important than caution. The Athamark around his neck became the symbol of that moment, of the principle that first contact was built on, that mercy transcends species, that kindness needs no translation, that the best of humanity wasn't found in its weapons or its technology but in its capacity to care for the vulnerable. Years later, when the Crown Heir took her throne and the first human ship prepared to visit the Ascendant Realm's capital world, she would insist that Mark Chin be aboard. Not as a diplomat or dignitary or representative of Earth's government. Just as the man who had wrapped his jacket around her shoulders and told her, in a language she barely understood, that she was going to be okay. Because she was. They all were. And it started in a field under an alien shadow, when one person chose compassion over fear and changed the course of two civilizations. The Athamark still hangs in the Ascendant Hall of Honor, a replica preserved in their historical records. Mark's original stays with his family, passed down through generations, as a reminder that the greatest moments in history sometimes start with the smallest acts of grace. That when we face the unknown, the best of humanity isn't our ability to conquer or dominate, but our willingness to help, to heal, to extend gentle hands to those who need them. And somewhere in the diplomatic archives of two species, there's a recording of a little girl with two large eyes looking up at a stranger who just saved her life, and saying one word in a language she was still learning. Saved! She was right. But not just her. In that moment, with that choice, Mark Chin saved something larger than one life. He saved the possibility that first contact could be beautiful instead of brutal, that two species could meet across the void and find common ground in the fundamental truth that protecting the vulnerable is what separates civilization from chaos. The fleet still visits Earth, though now they come as allies and friends. The warships remain, but they guard joint endeavors, protect shared interests, stand as monuments to a friendship born from crisis and sealed with honor. Earth and the Ascendant Realm build their future together, one careful step at a time, always remembering that it started with one person who saw someone in need and responded with humanity's oldest and best instinct. To help. To heal. To care. That's the story they tell in both civilizations now. Not the story of invasion or conquest or first contact protocols, but the story of Mark Chin and the Crown Heir, of a debt acknowledged and a friendship forged, of the day a farmer looked up at an armada and felt no fear because he knew he'd done the right thing. And in that knowing, in that simple certainty that helping was its own reward, he gave humanity the best first impression it could possibly offer, that we are a species worth knowing, worth saving, worth calling friends. The wheat still grows in that field. Mark still tends his farm, though now he has help from diplomatic aides and security details and the occasional visiting delegation from halfway across the galaxy. The barn his grandfather built still stands, bearing new scars from that first pod's impact but stronger for the repairs. And every spring, when the Crown Heir's birthday approaches in the Ascendant calendar, a ship descends, and a young queen in training visits the place where her life was saved. She walks through the wheat fields with Mark, practices her English, asks about horses and farming and the simple life that seems impossibly distant from her own. They talk about responsibility and duty and the weight of debts that can never truly be repaid. But mostly they just sit on the porch and watch the sunset, a farmer and a future queen bound by the simplest and most profound truth in either of their civilizations, that when someone needs help, you help them. Everything else, all the complexity and politics and interstellar relations, flows from that single choice. And on both worlds, in both histories, they call it the Athavel moment. The moment when one species showed another that mercy isn't weakness, that compassion isn't foolishness, that the gentle hand extended to help is stronger than any weapon. The moment when Mark Chen looked at an injured child and saw not an alien or a threat or a diplomatic opportunity, but just someone who needed help, and gave it. That's humanity at its best. That's the future worth building. That's the story worth telling across generations and across stars. Not of humanity's triumph over the alien, but of humanity's triumph over its own fear, its own suspicion, its own impulse to withdraw from the unknown. The Queen was right. It took foolishness or wisdom, and perhaps they're the same thing in the end, the courage to do what's right regardless of consequence, to help regardless of reward, to be gentle when the world gives you every reason to be hard. Mark Chen saved a dying alien girl, and in doing so saved us all.